Recapitulating our discussions in the previous week, where we discussed that among several movements that began their career in 1960s and early 70s, perhaps environmental movement is the only movement which has retained its vigor and vitality and has emerged as one of the dominating movements of contemporary times. The success of environmental movements are clearly visible from the amount of resources that it has preserved, as well as varieties of legislations that it has enacted in the contemporary times. Environmental movements in contemporary times have successfully challenged industrialism and the uncontrolled economic growth process. One of the important things about environmental movement is that while the idea of environmentalism and the problem of environmental degradation are essentially global concerns, most of the collective action or collective mobilization concerning nature are intensely local. May this be anti-dam struggles throughout the globe, or the Green Belt movement in Kenya, the Chipko and the Narmada Bachao Andolan in India, or the NIMBY protest, the not in my backyard protest in Western Europe and Northern America. Environmental mobilization has intensely emerged as a local phenomenon. The issue of locality and materiality in these contemporary environmental movements emerge as dominating features, more so in the context of post-globalized era, where local has become more and more less autonomous from the actions taking place elsewhere, in the sense that actions and activities taking place elsewhere are now influencing the local activities. Likewise, in this post-globalized era, the nation state has also lost its supreme power of suppressing the locality or the particularities of the locality. In this context, when local has no more remained as an autonomous, independent category, and the national state, which has lost its supreme power of controlling or suppressing the local, the global local linkage on environmental movements emerge as matters of crucial significance. So therefore, it is important to understand the global local linkages or global local nexus in contemporary environmental movements. As we just discussed, that environmental movements or environmental mobilizations are intensely local, whereas the ideas, the resources or the issues that it raises are essentially global in nature. So this module, titled as Environmental Movements in Global and Local Perspective, aims to examine the relationship or the connections between global and local context. The major objective of this module is to explore how environmental movements exist in local and global perspectives and to examine the characteristics of global and local environmental movements. The module also aims to understand the nexus between global and local perspectives. After completing this module, you will be able to distinguish between the global and local context of environmental movements and to explain how scale shift and diffusion happens between local and global context in environmental movements. In today's class, we will basically discuss three themes or three topics. To begin with, we will start this lecture with distinguishing or differentiating between global and local environmental movements, where we will discuss how environmental movements are emerging as global phenomenon so far as ideas, ideologies and issues are concerned, whereas when it comes to the mobilization, when it comes to the protest events, locality or materiality still remains significant. So in that context, we will discuss about environmental movements in the global and local context or global and local perspectives. In the second part of this lecture, we will focus more on the theoretical aspects of social movements or environmental social movements, where we will discuss diffusion and scale shift in environmental movements. So by diffusion and scale shift, I basically try to explain how local gets connected with global, or how global ideas, global concerns for environmental protection or environmental preservation diffused to the local level. In the third part of this class, I will take one empirical incidence of environmental movement, the Niyamgiri movement in Odisha, to explain the global local nexus or to explain global local connections in contemporary environmental movements. In this first part of this class, let us discuss the differences between global and local environmental movements. Viewed as a global phenomenon, environmental movements may be considered as a departure from the industrialism. In that context, or in that sense, global environmental movements successfully challenge the uncontrolled capitalist economic growth. These movements raise a moral as well as an ethical questions about nature. They raise an ethical moral question because they demand a change in our relationship with nature. They demand a change in which we connect, we use, and we approach the natural resources or the environment. These movements aim to protect or conserve the planet Earth. So in that sense, these movements are necessarily or essentially global in nature, because the issues that raise are of global significance. The resources that they want to protect are of global nature. They want to protect the planet Earth, the larger ecosystem, and by doing so, most importantly, these environmental movements of contemporary times aim to protect the humanity. Because essentially the point that environmental movements argue, or the point that environmental movements raise, is that what is at stake is the humanity. The humanity is at stake, the future generation is at stake, and therefore we need to protect the natural resources, because our sustenance on this planet Earth essentially related to existence of a safe environment. So therefore these environmental movements, while they aim to protect natural resources, while they aim to preserve the environment, by doing so they also aim to preserve humanity in this planet Earth. And these global environmental ideas or global environmental movements manifest both in two contradictory discourses that we have already discussed. They manifest themselves in both ecocentric approach, whereas while at the same time in managerial approach. From an ecocentric perspective, these global environmental movements try to relook the way in which we approach the natural resources. It aims at protecting the resources, protecting the nature for the sake of the nature, while at the same time the managerial approach or the global environmental movement from a managerial approach aims at managing the nature or dealing with the nature so that nature can be managed in an efficient way, and humanity can take benefit out of this nature. So these global environmental movements, as I told, raise pertinent questions. They raise pertinent issues like that of pollution, greenhouse effect, global warming, climate change, ozone depletion, and biodiversity or loss of biodiversity. What are the characteristics of these global environmental movements? Let us discuss some of the fundamental characteristics of these global environmental movements. Perhaps the first significant characteristics of these global environmental movements are its institutionalization. In other words, contemporary global environmental movements are institutionalized, or these movements are heading towards institutionalization. What do we mean by institutionalization? By institutionalization, I mean more and more focus is laid on organizational aspect of the movement rather than the protest event itself. Contemporary global environmental movements emphasize more on movement organizations, emphasize more on organizational aspect of the movement rather than on physicality or rather than on protest events. In that sense, contemporary environmental movements manifest through environmental movement organizations. We may take several examples like Greenpeace, like WWF, or Worldwide Fund for Nature, Earth First. So these or maybe UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. These are global environmental organizations. These are global environmental movement organizations which aim at preserving the nature, which aim at protecting the nature. So in that sense, environmental movements in contemporary times are heading towards institutionalization. The global environmental movements which raise global issues, they are heading towards institutionalization. The second important characteristic is that of professionalization. Professionalization, I mean environmental movement organizations are emerging as professional organizations where a lot of efforts, a lot of emphasis is put on rank and file of the organizations. There are leadership structures, there are organizational patterns, there are funds and finances of these environmental movement organizations. So in that sense, environmental movement organizations are becoming more and more professional. And with respect to their method of protest, these global environmental movements are also emerging as professional, in the sense that, as I told, that emphasis is less on protest, emphasis is less on environmental struggle, whereas emphasis is more on working in an institutionalized structure. Like these movements function as pressure groups, these movements function as public interest lobby organizations, where they aim at putting pressure on the state. They aim at working along with the state to prepare policies, to prepare programs for better environmental management or for protection of nature. So in that sense, these global environmental movements play an important role in policy making, because the ultimate aim is to protect the nature, and they prefer to protect the nature with institutional mechanisms, with institutional methods. The third characteristics of this global environmental movement is the successful use of mass media. So these movements are always mediated through mass media, and they make successful use of this mass media to convey a message to the society, to convey a message to the humanity. And these movements use different mass media in the sense that print and local media to convey a message to the society. The fourth characteristics of these environmental movements are its formation of green parties. Like we discussed in the previous class, in the Western European countries, there are several countries, like for example Germany, like for example England, or different Scandinavian countries, where environmental organizations or environmental movement organizations have successfully transformed themselves into political parties. Like the German Greens, Scottish Greens, these are well established political parties who participate in electoral processes, who participate in democratic politics, who contest elections, and who produce electoral agendas, and the aim is to come out with better policies, better governance structures, better governance frameworks for protection and preservation of nature. So these global environmental movements emphasize more on organizational aspects, they emphasize more on resource mobilization, and they rely more on science and technology. So science and technology becomes effective tools with which these environmental movement organizations or these global movements try to protect the nature. As I just discussed, that while with regard to ideas and ideologies these movements are global, with regard to action, with regard to collective mobilization, these movements functions at the grassroots level. So in that sense, these movements are intensely local. So locality and materiality still continues to dominate in some of these environmental movements. These local movements highlight issues of local environmental degradation arising out of, let's say for example, pollution, deforestation, and water scarcity. One of the defining characteristics of local environmental movements is that of direct action. While global movements prefer to function more through institutional mechanisms, more through professional protest organizations or professional environmental movement organizations, local environmental movements function with direct confrontations. So therefore protest, struggle, they become important strategies, they become preferred strategies for these local environmental movement organizations. Emphasis in the context of local environmental movement organizations is more on the event of collective mobilization. These movements essentially mobilize people, mobilize local people at the grassroots level, and they emphasize less on organizational structure of environmental movements. So here what is emphasized is the protest event. What is emphasized is the public protest. There is mass participation, there is popular participation, popular mobilization, and the movement relies more on people's participation at the grassroots level in a more confrontational manner rather than institutionalized structures or professional organizations. So in that sense, one of the defining characteristics of this local environmental movement organizations is its juxtaposition, or is its relationship with issues of class, issues of ethnicity, gender, human rights, or indigeneity. So in that sense, issues of, let's take for example class, issues of class emerge significantly in local environmental movement organizations, because as these movement organizations emerge out of local context of environmental degradation, these movements try to figure out, these movements try to portray that environmental degradation is not class neutral. They affect different classes differently. So therefore there is a significant class dimension in environmental movements, whereas global environmental movements manifest itself as class neutral. Class is not foregrounded in global environmental movement organizations because the issue that they raise are of global in nature, which are beyond class, beyond geography, and beyond space. So in essence, what I am trying to argue in this part of the lecture is that environmental movements manifest themselves in both local and global perspectives. Perhaps we can understand the local global differences and the local global connections in more better way if you look at this figure. Let's have a look at this figure, where I have taken this framework from Mario Diani and Paolo Donati's framework of understanding social movement organizations. Diani and Donati say that social movement organizations face basically two choices. With regard to resource mobilization strategy, they are either professional or participatory. Participatory in the sense that where emphasis is more on mobilization, emphasis is more on public protest, emphasis is more on grassroots mobilization and people's participation. Similarly, with regard to forms of action, environmental movements can be conventional or non-conventional. Conventional in the sense more institutionalized, more professionalized, non-conventional in the sense that where they rely more on disruption, they rely more on protest, they rely more on direct action. And what Diani and Donati try to point out that environmental movement organizations in the contemporary times or global environmental movements are shifting towards from a participatory protest movement to that of institutionalized environmental movement organizations. So therefore, these movements are more and more professionalized, these movements are more and more institutionalized, and the method of protest for them is more conventional. Conventional in the sense that more institutionalized forms of protest. So therefore, with regard to the distinction or with regard to the connection between local and global environmental movement organizations or local and global environmental movements, Mario Diani and Paolo Donati's framework suggests that contemporary global environmental movements have two important characteristics. With regard to forms of action, they rely more on conventional methods of protest, that is institutionalized methods of protest, where they work along with the government, along with the state. They function as pressure groups, they function as policy makers, where they help the government, help the state in making policies. And with regard to the resource mobilization strategy, they are more professional, where emphasis is more on organization, emphasis is more on rank and file, and where these movements depend more on a membership base. They have a strong membership base, and it is these organizations or it is these environmental movement organizations which play a greater role. Whereas local environmental movement organizations or whereas local environmental movements are more participatory in nature, where the emphasis is more on mass mobilization, and with regard to their forms of action, they rely more on direct action or non-conventional methods. So to summarize this part, we may say that environmental movements manifest in two forms. With regard to the global environmental movements, they are more institutionalized, they are more professionalized, and the forms of protest, the forms of struggle for them are more institutional or conventional. Whereas with regard to the local environmental struggles, local environmental movements, they rely more on non-conventional methods of protest like confrontation, like direct action, like more and more confrontation or direct action. And with regard to the resource mobilization, they rely more on people's participation or collective mobilization. As I told that environmental movement exists both in the local and global context. The ideas, the issues, and the questions that they raise are more global in nature, whereas when it comes to action, when it comes to collective mobilization, they are intensely local. So therefore, there is an opportunity to understand the global local linkages, the global local connections in environmental movements, which we will do in the next part of this class.